Hey, this is Josh for the Camera Project, and we're here in front of the New York Public Library at 6th Avenue and 42nd Street, and we're talking about the Olympus 25mm 1.2 Pro lens. Now this is the top of the line standard lens from Olympus, and like its other Pro lenses, features the manual clutch mechanism, the function button. It comes with this nice hood with a locking mechanism. And of course, the real standout here is the f1.2 aperture, along with the weather sealing. But the real question about this lens, at $11.99 and 14.4 ounces, you could buy the 25mm 1.8 lens for a third of the price and a third of the weight. So we're gonna explore whether this lens is for you and the things that 1.2 buys you. So we're gonna walk around the area and see what we come up with, and Allison has graciously agreed to be both our model and our shooter today. So we're gonna see how that goes. Okay, so probably the reason that you're gonna be buying this lens is for the f1.2 aperture. So let's talk about what that 1.2 aperture does for depth of field. How big of a difference is 1.2 and 1.8? Now numerically, it doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but it's actually 1 1/3 stops. So we're gonna take some pictures of Allison and see what it does in terms of bokeh and background and see how it affects the photo. All right, so here we are at f1.2. I'm gonna just take a couple shots like that, and then I'm gonna quickly switch over to f1.8.
All right, so let's take a look at some of the pictures from this test to compare the depth of field between the 25mm 1.2 set to 1.2 and then the 25mm 1.2 set to 1.8. Again, all of these tests are with the same 25mm 1.2 lens. Now, we're not typically ones for crazy pixel peeping on this channel, but we do want to compare the differences between the depth of field, so we do need to look at some of the subtleties there. Now, as a general observation, we did notice that the 1.2s came in a bit darker overall. I don't know if it was something to do with the way the camera metered for it, and I think it is a hair of vignetting that we're seeing on the 1.2 side. Certainly nothing too dramatic. Let's take a look. On the left, we have the 1.2, as you can see here, by the f1.2, and on the right, the 1.8. So if we look at Allison, they both look good. I would say the 1.8 does appear to be slightly sharper. Of course, the lens wide open is not going to be its sharpest, but it's still very acceptable and can certainly be sharpened a bit in post to get it up to the level of the 1.8. It's certainly very usable at that 1.2 aperture. Now, if we look at the bokeh, it's certainly different between the 1.2 and 1.8. I'm not going to dwell too much on it on this example because I think we will have some other examples that make it a bit clearer some of the differences between them. Now, in terms of the overall out of focus blur on the background, you certainly can see the difference between the 1.2 on the left and the 1.8 on the right. It's not drastic certainly, but noticeable, yes. If we go to a tighter version of these shots, you can definitely see some differences here. First of all, on the left, on the 1.2, it's a lot more noticeably out of focus in the background, and that's the plus side. The downside, I would say, would be the shape of the bokeh, where on the right you have this nice round quality to them. On the left, they're a little bit more oval or lemon-shaped, and you can see a bit more harshness, I would say, to the ones on the left at the 1.2. But certainly in terms of out of focus background blur, the 1.2 is definitely giving us an advantage there. Now this difference is really subtle, but it is noticeable. We have a background that's very close to our subject. Allison is sitting just a foot or two away from this wall, and on the right at 1.8, it's out of focus a bit, but it comes across as a lot more in focus than it does on the left side at 1.2, and we are really noticing the difference in the separation there. Hopefully you guys can see that on your monitors, but it's definitely coming across in this where she is so close to her background. Here's just a tighter example of that same setup, so you can see the difference between the 1.2 and the 1.8. Now in this one, you can see the smoothness of the 1.2 bokeh kind of blending together compared to the 1.8, where you can see a little bit more differentiation between the three subjects. Here, again, you can see the difference between the 1.2, which is certainly blurrier than the 1.8 on the right.
So now we're inside the library and we're going to do some low light tests to see what difference 1.3 stops makes in terms of ISO. Let's say you need to capture some action and keep your shutter speed at say 1/200th or higher. The difference between ISO 6400 and 2500 is a big deal, especially in micro four thirds. Even more so 8000 to 3200, that's really noticeable. So let's take a look at some pictures and see how that affects the photo.
Now, as we move to the inside, we really want to focus less on the difference in depth of field, which of course you'll see as well, but more on the difference of what ISO is going to be. Let's say you need to maintain a certain shutter speed. Now, we could have certainly used a lower shutter speed in these examples, but we want to illustrate what would it be like if you were shooting something that was a certain speed of action where you needed to freeze that and needed to maintain those higher shutter speeds or shoot in really low light. So if we take a look at the 1.2 side, we have it at ISO 2500 versus ISO 6400 on the right at 1.8. Let's just take a look at what that does, and certainly a more pronounced noise on the ISO 6400. Now, the 1.8 does have the advantage of being slightly sharper, which could help you to be able to reduce the noise a bit. So, it does have that one advantage there, but certainly if we look at darker areas of the frame, especially, you can tell the difference between the 2500 and the 6400 with the micro four thirds sensor size, certainly. So on the left, we have ISO 2500 at 1.2 and 6400 at 1.8. Now, these are certainly different exposure-wise, and again, we noticed that the 1.2s were coming out darker for some reason. So if I were to brighten these up, it would be a bit more level playing field. Not sure what to make of how the camera was sort of reading and rendering the brightness and darkness of the scenes here. But again, 2500 versus 6400 is certainly noticeable. So here we have a less extreme example. On the left, we have the 1.2 at ISO 500 versus 12,500 at 1.8. Now, the 12,500 is certainly not a deal breaker, but you can certainly see the 500 is much more clean. Now, another test we wanted to do was testing the actual differences between the 1.2 25mm and the much cheaper, lighter, smaller 25mm 1.8 that's been out for a few years. Now, here you do see some differences, so let's take a look. We're not just comparing the 1.8 aperture to the 1.2 aperture, let's actually compare the two different lenses. So again, these aren't super scientific. We tried to keep the photos similar when we could, but they're not always exactly the same. And we shot both lenses at 1.8 just to keep sort of the playing field equal. Now, if we go to the right-hand side, that's the 25mm 1.8 lens. The left-hand side is the 1.2 lens. You definitely see the left-hand side is a little bit sharper. Nothing too crazy there. Really pretty comparable in terms of that. If we go to the out of focus area, again, nothing too drastic in this wide shot. You could sort of see a little bit of that sort of nervous background blur on the 25 1.8 on the right-hand side, whereas here on the left-hand side, it's a bit smoother, and we'll definitely see more of that in other photos. So here we again have the 1.2 on the left-hand side, the 1.8 on the right-hand side, both being shot at 1.8. And at first glance, other than some slight exposure differences, they're very similar. Now, if we do take a closer look, again, you could see that some of the branch, the small detail, is certainly nicer on the 1.2 side. It's just a bit smoother, creamier, where this is a bit more frantic of a pattern. Hopefully it's not too hard to see online. You could probably see it a little bit more in these branches. Now, if we're looking at the actual in-subject area, they're both very sharp. Let's take a look at some more of this out of focus area. Yeah, and you can see it's definitely a bit smoother on the left-hand side, but it's nothing that most people would notice, with the taxi cab lights on the right-hand side being too objectionable. There are some issues, maybe a little bit of fringing in this area, but nothing too drastic, I would say, that it's going to stop most people from using that lens. Okay, so now we have the 1.2 on the left and the 1.8 on the right, both being shot at 1.8. Let's go to the trees again. Yeah, you could definitely see the same kind of smoothness on the 1.2 side and a little bit of that frantic quality on the 1.8 side, unless you're really zoomed in at this kind of level. or you're really particular about these kind of things, it's not going to be too much of an issue, but it's something to look out for, certainly. Okay, on this one, you could definitely see that the 1.2 on the left appears sharper on this example than the 1.8 does on the right. Now, I was focused on the wheel on both of them. Take a look to the background areas. Again, I would certainly say the 1.2 has a nicer rendering of this out of focus bokeh than this, slightly fringy version on the 1.8, sort of similar to what we saw in the taxi cab shot earlier. Again, we have very similar results on these. Let's take a look at this out of focus, and the same finding here. It's definitely a more pleasant bokeh in the 1.2 in this example, a little bit harsher here. If we take a look at the branches, yeah, similar kind of findings, a bit more of a smooth fall off versus a little bit of that nervousness in this area here. And on this last one, we just did kind of a studio test at this same thing. We have a 25 1.2 on the left and the 1.8 on the right. And you can see overall they both look very sharp. If we come into the in focus areas and I lock these up, you can see they both look very good. The 1.2 is a little bit sharper at 1.8 than the 1.8 is at 1.8, certainly. But where the 1.2 really shines here is if we come and look at some of the out of focus areas. The bokeh, neither is too objectionable. The 1.2 is a little smoother, but you really see the difference in this area where you definitely have this kind of harsh line on the plant here and a much smoother edge here. Let's see if we could see that anywhere else. Yeah, that's the clearest spot where you could see it right here, the harshness of the one side versus the smoothness on the 1.2.
So let's talk about our final thoughts on the Olympus 25mm 1.2 lens and who it's for. Now, yes, there are going to be some differences between the bokeh and this of the 25 1.8, and yes, this is weather sealed. But for the average photographer who's not necessarily a pixel peeper, you may not notice that. So the people who really are going to want this lens are the people looking for a weather sealed lens and the people who need to shoot sort of event type photography, weddings and things like that in low light. That's where this lens really shines, the low light performance. Now, one thing about the low light performance that I didn't love on the EM5 Mark II anyway was the focusing speed, which isn't always stellar. If you're using it in sort of a portrait situation, it's okay, but if you have something fast motion, it was hit or miss, and I'd really like to see how it does with the EM1 Mark II and something with a newer autofocus system. Overall, I thought the lens was really great, sharp at the 1.2, which is really key to this lens, and if you're the person who needs that low light, weather sealed monster of a lens, this guy is going to be for you. As usual, if you like this video, please subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate it. And let us know if you'd like to see more videos like this or what else you guys want to watch. Hope to see you guys soon.
Just wanted to finish off by showing you some of my favorites from the Olympus 25mm f1.2 lens, and I also wanted to take this time to thank our friends over at Unique Photo who helped supply the lens for this review. If you don't know them, please check them out at uniquephoto.com.